Hey everyone, Joshua Kirk here with you once again, and now it's time for another list video, not a year-end list, but rather a decade-end list. My top 50 albums of the 2010s, a list that's been a couple of years in the making, because I know most of these lists came out near the end of 2019 or in between 2020, but I needed to do a little catching up on some albums in order to create a list of this size. But as of the first quarter of 2022, I felt like I had enough albums that I could create this sort of list. And I'm very excited to share with you the albums that eventually made the final cut on my favorite records of the decade. And yeah, I hope you enjoy hearing me go through all of them in this video. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Starting with number 50, which is the original cast recording of Hamilton from Lin-Manuel Miranda. 49 is Lightning Bolt's Sonic Citadel, one of the decade's best noise rock projects. 48 is Daft Punk's Random Access Memories. 47 is the self-titled Clipping album. 46 is probably my trip-hop album of the decade, and that is ThieveryCorporation's Culture of Fear. 45 is Queens of the Stone Age, like Clockwork. 44 is Jonah Tolchin's Clover Lane, this very versatile and well-written Americana and singer-songwriter album. 43 is Danny Brown with the very unsettling and trippy Atrocity exhibition. 42 is SOPHIE, rest in peace, with Oil of Every Pearl's on Insides. 41 is Lana Del Rey's Norman fucking Rockwell. 40 is Dr. Dog's Abandoned Mansion, which is a great culmination of everything that band has done up to that point, and really my favorite record they put out in the 2010s. 39 is the self-titled St. Vincent album. 38 is Arcade Fire's The Suburbs. 37 is Mannequin Pussy's Patience, which is this very raw, catchy, and very emotional pop-punk and indie rock album. 36 is the incredibly nerdy but also very fun album from Lemon Demon, Spirit Phone. 35 is Algiers with the Underside of Power, an album that continues to age really well with every passing year. 34 is 100 gecs with 1,000 gecs. I'm not even going to apologize for having this album on here. It's so weird and chaotic, but I love it. 33 is Open Mike Eagle's Brick Body Kid Still Daydream, which has some of the best wordplay and production I've heard in underground hip-hop in the last few years. 32 is Fiona Apple's The Idler Wheel. 31 is Perfume Genius with No Shape. 30 is Parquet Courts with the politically charged, fun, and fast-paced Wide Awake. 29 is Jamie XX with In Color, one of my favorite dance and house records from this decade, and probably of all time as well. 28 is the debut album from Kacey Musgraves, Same Trailer, Different Park. Great songwriting on that. 27 is the queen of futuristic Latin pop, Rosalia with El Mal Querer, and then we round out the bottom half of the list with 26, Watch House, formerly known as Mantle in Orange with Blindfaller, which is one of the most heartfelt, beautiful, and well-written folk pop and Americana albums of this decade. We're there at the top half of the list, starting things off with Beach House, Teen Dream at 25. This album pretty much needs no introduction at this point. It's hailed as a dream pop classic by lots of folks, and I can't disagree. I think this album has beautiful, lush instrumentation, great vocal performances, and songwriting. Yeah, this is, I think, pretty much an essential listen for anyone wanting to get into the dream pop genre. 24 is Swan's To Be Kind, which is easily one of the most insane and manic experimental rock records of this decade and probably ever recorded. Like, for an album that is 2 hours, it literally feels half its length because it's like one of the most hypnotic things I've ever heard, and just like the performances are just super in your face, but there's also some great, beautiful, and progressive moments here and there. So yeah, this record absolutely rules. 23, it wouldn't be a decade-end list for the 2010s without Kendrick Lamar, so he's here with Good Kid, Mad City, which has a very fascinating narrative concept behind it, and the production is a really good balance between, like, it's definitely that old school West Coast hip-hop sound, but still having all those modern touches, and even with it being as immersive as it is, I think, one of his more accessible projects. Like, it's a pretty easy record to go back to, and yeah, it's just a really special rap album. 22 is Run the Jewels with RTJ2, and I'm just going to say I think we need Run the Jewels more than ever now. Like, not only does this album have great lyrics on it, but also Killer Mike and LP just have great chemistry with one another. The beats are insane, the features are crazy. Yeah, this rap album just goes really hard. 21 is Jason Isbell with Southeastern. It really wouldn't be a 2010s list for me without Jason. He's one of my favorite songwriters working today, and this album pretty much kicked off the really strong 4-album run he's had as of late, with just super dark and powerful ballads on this one, and I think really this is an essential Americana album for anyone who wants to get into the genre. This is an album I would recommend, and plus Cover Me Up is easily one of my favorite songs of the decade. 20 is Jukebox the Ghost with Everything Under the Sun, an album that more people I think should be really taking note of, because I think this is genuinely an indie pop classic in my book. The blends of power pop and prog rock and kind of those twee indie elements is done really well. It's got great songwriting, and performances and production are spot on for the most part. And yeah, I think this album has a really nice flow, and I really like the kind of loose concept it has too, which in a way their debut also kind of has this too. And yeah, I think this record is really something special, and it absolutely rules. 19 is the self-titled Kids See Ghosts album, which I'm going to go ahead and say this is the only Kanye-related project on this list, so I know it's a little controversial that I don't have My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy in here, but that's a different conversation. Obviously, this is Kanye working with Kid Cudi, and this album, I think, really was a surprise no one saw coming. Like, not only does Kid Cudi deliver some of his best performances and writing ever on here, but also, like, the beat choices are easily some of the most creative I've heard in mainstream hip-hop in the last few years, and even with it being 23 minutes long, it still, like, feels like a full journey that is super fun, interesting, and emotionally captivating. So yes, great project. 18 is Jeff Rosenstock's Worry, which I think is a pop-punk epic for the ages. I think Jeff is one of the best in this genre right now, and this is basically everything I would want a pop-punk album to be, with killer performances, production, songwriting, and concepts. Like, and even the sequencing is really fascinating. How the first half of this record has a bunch of normal kind of standalone songs, but then the second half has all these short bangers that all transition into one another. Like, the whole punk rock Abbey Road assessment of this record I think is pretty accurate, because this album definitely very much feels that way, and yeah, it just kicks so much ass. 17 is Tyler the Creator's Igor, and I'm going to say Tyler's musical evolution, I think, has been one of the most, I think, exciting to watch over these last few years, and I think this is the album where he really came into his own. Like, even though there are definitely albums out there that sound similar and try to do, like, knockoffs of this record, but I still somehow don't really hear much that sounds like this album. Like, I mean, he's blurring genre in some really fascinating ways on here, and I love the whole breakup story that is told throughout the record, and it's an album I highly recommend listening to as a whole because all the little vignettes and kind of the significant moments in this story, I think the way they're threaded together is so powerful and very emotional to listen to. Even though there are definitely songs on here that I do go back to pretty often because I think they're bangers, this album, I think, really materializes when you really take it all in as a full experience. So yes, fantastic album. 16 is Tame Impala's Lonerism, which is a pretty strong contender for my favorite noise rock album. Sorry, psych rock album of the decade. It's lo-fi, but it still has great melodies and has really good songwriting on it too. And another kind of controversial take here, this is the only Tame Impala record on my list, because I know Currents is really his big breakthrough, and that one has been a big one on a lot of decade-end lists. But I'm not the biggest Tame Impala fan personally, but for when I want that just catchy, psychedelic goodness, this is the album I go to, without a doubt. 15 is Pup's Morbid Stuff, which is easily my favorite pop-punk record of the decade. I mean, it definitely has that lo-fi-ness that a lot of other stuff in this lane does, but like the passion and just the incredible hooks and performances, and the songwriting is very heartfelt and occasionally very uncomfortable in terms of how it describes a kind of messy, unfiltered mind. And yeah, I think it's just pulled off so well, and I think this is the album where Pup really solidified themselves as pretty much a band to beat in this particular genre. 14 is Jay Som's On a Co., which is an incredibly underrated, overlooked album in my view. A really shocking record for me, not because of how it sounds, but more because I remember hearing Jay Som's last record and just not buying into the hype at all, but this record really surprised me. She really stepped up as a songwriter and performer on this one. The production is a lot better too, and even with the vocals being like really soft, I think they add to the vibe really well, and there's still like this very unique identity to it, even if it is totally inspired by some 90s indie rock and shoegaze. And yeah, I just hope after I mention this record, more people get on the wave, because this album's something special. 13 is really one of the most interesting and colorful underground rock records of the last few years, and that is Crying's Beyond the Fleeting Gales. It kind of makes me a little sad that we potentially may not get another Crying album, but if this is, like, you know, they're gonna be their swan song, I'm totally okay with it, because I think it has just very fun, catchy songs that have really cool and futuristic blends of chiptune, prog rock, a bit of, like, you know, classic heavy metal and hard rock here and there, too. I mean, this record is a perfect balance of sounding like something from the 90s, but also sounding like something only Gen Z would put together. So yes, this album rules and absolutely slaps. 12, I think, is probably the most iconic experimental hip-hop album ever made, and that is Death Grips' The Money Store, which I don't think really needs an introduction at this point. And even with all the experimental hip-hop that's followed since this record, there's still no group really like Death Grips in terms of their sound and just the insanity of how they, like, obliterate genre as well. And also how, you know, they played a big part of the whole internet music culture in a way. So, yeah, for those reasons, yeah, The Money Store deserves a spot on this list, in my opinion. Now we're at number 11. We're really close to the top 10, and my number 11 is Father John Misty's I Love You Honey Bear, which I think is easily his best album in terms of just some of the most witty and clever and kind of emotionally conflicted songwriting I've heard in indie folk really in my life. And I think the instrumentation is gorgeous as well. And the vocal performances, like there's this kind of showiness to this album that I really like a lot too. And it's an album that'll either make you laugh out loud at the sarcasm or just make you weep uncontrollably at just how depressing a lot of these songs are. So yes, this album is special, and I think, yeah, we can all agree that, Tillman really peaked at this point in his career. We're there in the top 10 now, starting things off with 10. Phoebe Bridgers, Stranger in the Alps. This record, I did a huge 180 on this record because I remember not really being super sold on it when it first came out, when I heard it at the time, but with me progressively becoming the diehard Phoebe fan that I am now, I went back to this record, and yes, as I expected, I genuinely adore this record now. It has, I think, some of the best lyrics, I think, of an indie singer-songwriter album from this decade, and like her vocals are incredible too, and even the production, the way it manages to blur folk and Americana with this kind of dreamy atmosphere, and like the sound design on this record I think is really cool, and I think was elevated to another level on her sophomore record, as is I think nearly everything else on here. But yeah, this record's really something special. 9 is Freddie Gibbs and Madlib with Pinata, which, like, how do these two go so well together? Like, Madlib's incredibly trippy and really, like, beautiful beats, and, like, Freddie's pretty unstoppable flows, his great lyrical concepts, and just bars for the ages. Like, it's one of those albums where it's such a lightning in a bottle experience where I listen to it and just think in my head, like, wow, like, this is a combo right here. 8 is Sturgill Simpson with A Sailor's Guide to Earth, which is really, I think, one of the most beautiful and most well-arranged alternative country albums of this decade. Like, this is an album that really should not work as well as it does. An album that tackles themes of fatherhood, as well as kind of the political mess that's been going on in our country as of late, and like uses this like nautical these nautical like metaphors and themes to kind of thread all this together and make it one cohesive album. So the loose concept on here I think is done really well, and on top of that, the vocals, the writing, the instrumentation, like all of it is just so well done. I mean, Sturgill is an artist that I've always really liked. I've never been like head over heels for him, but I think this is the album where he absolutely peaked. 7 is No Name's Room 25, which I think is probably my jazz rap album of the decade. Just gorgeous instrumentals, pretty unmatched wordplay and poetry on this one. Performances are great, features are really good. Like, I don't really have a whole lot to say other than that. I just think this is pretty much what jazz rap should sound like, in my opinion. 6 is an album that I have a kind of personal connection with, so it's a little surprising. It's not in my top 5, but there are, I think, a few other records that I like just a little more than it, but it's still pretty high on this list all the same, and that is Fleet Foxes' Helplessness Blues, which I probably wouldn't have started making videos a long time ago about music if I hadn't heard this record. It means so much to me. I love the songwriting, and the instrumentation is so lush and kind of progressive at times, and like the vocal harmonies are stunning. I think The album is, I think, very much a step up from their debut in a lot of ways, which I know there are lots of debates as to which album is better. For me, I think this album kind of surpasses their debut in terms of, I just think it's a little more interesting, in my opinion, and I connect with it more on a songwriting level, too. And yeah, it's just, this is an indie folk classic to me. Number 5, I think, is also, I think, a pretty impactful indie folk record. That is Sufjan Stevens' Carrie and Lowell, which, out of all the records in my top 5, this is, I think, the least re-listenable, because this record is so sad. It's super sad. Like, I mean, few records really touch on grief, like, as potently as this record does, and I think it's beautiful, and it's really impressive that Sufjan, one of the most beloved figures in indie music, could kind of late into his career come out with like one of his most, I think, essential albums. So for those reasons, Carrie and Lowell deserves all the praise it can get, in my opinion. Number 4 is my favorite Jason Isbell record, this time with the 400 unit. That album is called The Nashville Sound, and I know it may be a little surprising that I think this is his best album, but it is, I think, the one I've played the most from him, and I think I connect with it maybe a little bit more than Southeastern on an emotional level, but like, yeah, this record, Jason pretty much was at the top of his game, and him and his band sound like a well-oiled machine on this one, and yeah, the songwriting, the performances, and Dave Kopp's production, as usual, is fantastic. Like, yeah, this record maybe, I think, is most accessible, but definitely far from his most boring, because this record is amazing. Number 3 is, I think, a pretty powerful kind of hip-hop concept album, and marked, I think, a pretty incredible evolution, one for the ages, for this artist, and that is Tyler, the Creator's Flower Boy, which is this very emotional, beautiful, fun, versatile, just like, I haven't heard really much of Tyler's stuff before this, even though it would be interesting to, you know, just to kind of understand his history and where he was coming from a little better, but this album and the shift it marked for Tyler could not be more radical, and it could not be more, you know, incredible as it is. Like, and, you know, I will shout out one of my favorite YouTubers who talks about music, Middle 8, for mentioning how the car and flower metaphors, like, work throughout the album, and it definitely helped me understand the album better, even if I've always really loved this album, and yeah, just, yeah, it's been a treat to watch these last few years of Tyler's career, and this album pretty much started that whole kind of thing. Number 2, it would be a sacrilege not to include this album on here. It's, I think, probably the one album on here where people are like, duh, of course this is one of the best of the decade, but To Pimp a Butterfly, man, this record, I don't revisit it a lot because it is very dense and layered, but it does not feel as long as it is because, like, literally every lyric, piece of instrumentation, performance, feature, and like every little like nuance throughout this album is just done so immaculately well. Like, this is pretty much one of the most, I think, important rap albums ever made, and yeah, I think Kendrick is easily among the greats in hip-hop in terms of, you know, how he, you know, reflects on the world around him, and, you know, how he just puts himself out there, and, like, he's super upfront about it all, and there's really not much else I could say that everyone else has already said, but it doesn't mean, you know, it shouldn't be said again and again and again, because Because, yeah, Kendrick's the GOAT. But now on to my number 1 album of the decade, which is the one album where I can listen to it at any time, no matter what mood I'm in, and I never get tired of this record. And yeah, it means so much to me, and it really connects with me more than any other album in the 2010s has. And that is Kacey Musgraves' Golden Hour. This album it means so much to me, from like the songwriting on here, which I think, there's a perfect balance between kind of somewhat silly, kind of cheeky songs on here, like Butterflies, or even High Horse, and Velvet Elvis, but like also just great sort of more introspective tracks like Happy and Sad and Lonely Weekend, and also just like emotionally powerful ballads like Mother and Rainbow. Or like Rainbow is easily one of my favorite songs of the decade. It's just so gorgeous and awe-inspiring. And yeah, and like her performances are great on this album, and like the production manages to be dreamy and, full of like spaciousness, but it doesn't feel like bland or middle of the road. Like, it still feels like Kacey's own sound in a way, and I feel like this is the album where she kind of found her voice and her sound, and the way that it blurs like country with pop, and even like some indie kind of singer-songwriter touches in a way. Like, it makes sense that so many different audiences connected with this album, and why it was one of the most acclaimed records of 2018. And yeah, it just, everything about it just absolutely strikes a chord with me. Like, even with that last Kacey Musgraves album being the letdown that it was, it still doesn't change the fact that I still really adore this record, and it will continue to really leave me in awe every single time. So yes, thank you, Kacey Musgraves, for coming out with the album of the 2010s in my book. And there you have it. Those are my top 50 records of the 2010s. I had a lot of fun going through these albums. I had a lot of fun putting this list together, and hopefully you guys had a lot of fun hearing me basically ramble on about all of them. But I feel free, if you have maybe a favorite albums of the 2010s list yourself, feel free to share them in the comments if you are interested. Chances are there's probably going to be some albums on here also on some of you guys' lists, and probably some of your own. And I know it's maybe a little bit shocking I don't have any Frank Ocean on here, because I know that there's been a lot of Frank Ocean on Decade End lists, but hey, whatever your list is, feel free to share with me, and hopefully some of the lesser known albums, after you hear me mention them, that you'll actually go give them a listen. And yeah, that's about all I have to say. This is Joshua Kirk, signing off.